On today's Hiwatt soundbite, we're calibrating the all-important subwoofer. Well, am I ever excited about today's session? You know, we're talking about subwoofers, and a few weeks ago I posted a session on near-field monitoring, and I really quite specifically and purposely left out any kind of detail and setup ideas about a subwoofer because, oh man, it is such an important and integral part of our monitoring system today. And I just feel like the subject of subwoofers warrant an entire session that we just take a few moments and talk about the critical subwoofer in your studio. So for today's session, I want to share some of my own personal experience of setup and calibration of subwoofers. And I want to take the time to check the calibration of this sub relative to my near fields using an analog SPL meter or sound pressure level meter. So let's get our sub on, okay? Decades ago, one of the most highly respected studio technicians that I've ever known in my career, John the Tech, gave me one of the single best pieces of advice regarding the subwoofer that I've ever heard. Stop thinking about that thing as a way to generate bottom end in your studio. That's not what it's for. A subwoofer should be thought of as strictly a means to extend the bass response of your monitor system lower than the near fields that you have. I really wish I would have listened to John's advice when he gave that to me decades ago, but it took me a number of years to sort of really incorporate what he was saying. I was very, very guilty in the early days of having way too much hype on that subwoofer in my studio. I mean, I would just rely way too much on what that thing was doing in my studio. And of course, it would just hurt my mixes, right? I mean, how many of you have experienced that where you're in your own studio and you've got this rockin' mix dialed up and you throw it down and you go listen to it in your car or something and it's just like, oh my goodness, what happened, right? In my own experience, I feel a lot of the disconnect that can happen between one's own personal mix space and the outside world very much relies around where that subwoofer is calibrated and how it's set up. Now, some of you might cringe when you hear this, but 4 years ago when I set this studio up, I actually didn't calibrate the subwoofer. I just used my ears. And I took a long time. I moved that sub to all kinds of different locations in the room, and I tried different phase positions and different cutoffs, of course. This morning, for the first time, I took the actual calibration measurements of that sub relative to my near fields. And oh man, very, very close to being spot on to KRK's initial instructions on how to set that up. Now, there's a big school of thought that believes you can't properly set up a subwoofer without a real-time analyzer, or at the very least an SPL meter, like a sound pressure level meter. I'm sort of going to go out on a limb here a little bit and suggest that I don't believe there's a better tool than your ear, period. As far as where the level of that sub is, another great piece of advice was shared with me once. Start at 0, bring that subwoofer up very slowly until you can just hear it in the sweet spot in that listening position, and then go ahead and turn that sub back down a little bit. You know, I know that sounds a little ridiculous, but honestly, that's a pretty good bit of advice to set the level of a sub. So when I sort of really started to adopt that bit of advice that John had given me about start treating that subwoofer like nothing more than an extension of the bottom. You don't want that thing booming. You want that thing to just smoothly transition the bass from your near field monitor down all the way through to the floor kind of thing, right down to the bottom. Well, going through that procedure this morning and measuring the actual calibration of this sub relative to my near fields, it absolutely confirmed two things. It confirmed that your ears are a fantastic tool to use for something like setting up a subwoofer. It also confirmed that this simple analog procedure using an SPL meter for setting the level of a sub is also a very accurate system and certainly a great starting point. So I'm going to hit pause here for a few minutes and I'm going to set up my SPL meter right at my listening position. And then I'm going to send a bunch of band-passed pink noise into the mains, take measurements, and into the sub, and we're going to take measurements. So here we go. All right, this is sort of like an internal field trip. So I've set up my analog SPL meter. It's a Radio Shack. Notice how I've got this meter set up. It's in my listening position, equidistant between the two speakers, and it's on a slight angle, like 45-degree angle. It's not looking directly at the speakers. So This is a Radio Shack, very simple but very accurate analog SPL meter. It's on the 80 dB range right now. I've got it set to C weighting and it's on slow response. So the very first thing we want to do is we want to send bandpassed pink noise to the main monitors. We're going to bandpass this pink noise from 500 hertz to 1 kilohertz, just meaning that anything below 500 is being filtered out, anything above 1K is being filtered out at 24 dB per octave. We're going to drive that bandpass pink noise into these speakers and adjust the volume to reach 85 dB on the SPL meter. So let's have a listen. Okay, so we had that averaging about 85 dB. Now we're going to take a measurement of that subwoofer relative to these mains. In this case, we're bandpassing the pink noise that feeds that sub between 30 and 70 hertz. Here's what that sounds like. So you can sort of imagine how excited I get when I see these results. It really confirms that there's nothing wrong with using your ear. I mean, this is one of the greatest tools that we have available to us. As long as you understand going in that that subwoofer is really there to just extend that bottom. You're not trying to hype everything up with it. Well, that was a successful test. I'm going to hit pause and I'm going to strike this little setup. Here we go. Now the active crossover that's built into that sub, when used properly with these speakers, it's designed and theoretically supposed to be set at 80 hertz, which is the 12 o'clock position on this particular subwoofer. Yeah, I didn't like the sound of this subwoofer actually until I decreased that center frequency much lower. In fact, to the very lowest it can be set. On the KRK, I think it's like 40 or 50 hertz. So that's the only deviation from KRK's suggested calibration procedure, is that I've gone in and just used my ear and fine-tuned that cutoff frequency based on what it is that I want to hear in my studio. These monitors are capable of reproducing some pretty good low end, but they're being fed from the active crossover of that sub. So they're being cut off at 80 hertz. So ultimately, there's sort of a hole I'm missing in this room between that lowest point there, that 50 hertz, and where these speakers take off, which is 80. So there's sort of a little range in there that's missing, but you know, it's not missing in any way, shape, or form. My room compensates for that. And this is the key about setting up that sub using your ear. You've just got to use your ear and don't worry about like technically what it's supposed to be. Sometimes when you read those instructions, you can't take them too literally. You just use it as a starting point, and then use your ear to fine tune. So I encourage you to try both methods. You know, if you've already gone through the process like I did 4 years ago of really dialing in your sub and spending a lot of time getting that thing dialed in, and you're getting good results with it, well, absolutely check those results against that kind of SPL reading like I did this morning. I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised with how powerful a tool your very own ear is.